So this is a qualitative paper by Dave Nicholls called The Experience of Chronic Breathlessness from back in 2003. And Nicholls starts off by establishing chronic breathlessness, dyspnea, as a subjective phenomenon like pain, and goes on to say that we've so far understood it in objective terms, in terms of pathophysiological markers and so on, and explains how that's inadequate and doesn't give us the full picture. There are some subjective measures that have been developed, of course, but Nicholls says these tend to be like on a scale, just trying to establish how bad it is, whereas they don't kind of fully flesh out the experience of what it's like to have dyspnea. So that's what he's trying to do here. He uses a phenomenological approach, which is obviously appropriate to try and understand people's lived experiences. He purposefully samples participants. It's kind of a nice little profile, mostly with COPD, bronchiectasis, someone who has asthma there. And unfortunately, he doesn't give us like a lot of information about how he reached sampling saturation. He doesn't give us much information about either the process of data analysis. He just talks about what phenomenology is. So that's a bit of a shame. But I don't want to spend too much time talking about all that. I want to kind of get onto the findings. He split up into a few different categories. The first is the experience of breathlessness. And I'm not going to do any of this justice, but I just want to try and pick out some of the most interesting points that are made. The first thing is that few participants were able to describe breathlessness adequately, and they had to resort to associated feelings and emotions, physical sensations like drowning, functional limitations, that kind of thing. They all talk about how isolating the experience of dyspnea is, and also about the stigma associated with it. So a lot of people are saying they don't want to go outside and socialize as much as they used to, and they have to be kind of they feel here it is kind of scrutinized, everyone's eyes on you, consciously breathing, that kind of thing. And then there's the kind of spectre of the wolf at the door. So of course we're always telling people to watch out for infections, telling people to stay on top of their breathlessness, but for them it's a kind of something that's a very real threat which they have to be vigilant for all the time, that kind of thing. The next category is strategies. This is really amazing, just the kind of lengths people have to go to function. Really, the consequences of poor self-management, Nicholls says, are so grave and fearful, and the disease so unpredictable that people are ever vigilant and become adept at self-monitoring. And there's a little description here of the level of organisation that people have to go to. I leave here, this participant says, at 10:05, because rehab starts at 11, and then I go to the waiting room at 25 to 11. At 22, I have 2 puffs of my inhaler. I start my exercises at 11 o'clock, and so on. So you really get to see the kind of military level of precision people reach just to kind of negotiate everyday activities. There's an interesting category here on the experience of healthcare. It's kind of seen as a trade-off between what people get from healthcare and what they have to give up, which is experienced as surveillance, Nicholls says. And of course this is the idea of people giving up information in terms of outcome measures, that kind of thing, being constantly monitored by the healthcare system to see how their physiological and psychosocial markers are doing. There's some stuff that we're probably quite familiar with about today's healthcare system being experienced as remote and aloof, that kind of thing. And we can move on to the category of death and spirituality. So dyspnea, or really COPD, is pretty unique in most of the chronic illnesses that we are associated with as physios, and that you could kind of die at any time. And this person here says something quite touching, which is that over the last 2 years friends have gone into hospital and they haven't come out, and it's been their first visit. I've been in to see them and they've had the mask on and they haven't lasted 3 or 4 days, and that's it, and that's emphysema. So it's this idea of participants having to be forced by their illness to reconcile themselves with their own death. And Nicholls emphasizes this is not a solitary act. All the participants depended heavily on family and friends. So that's another really important theme that probably, or in my experience, is doesn't come up much on pulmonary rehab. It's easy to forget that for these people, death is something they've had to become reconciled to. The final theme is mobility and walking. And I was quite surprised to see that walking was seen as a separate, kind of more symbolically important form of activity by everyone. Walking is freedom, it's good for the soul, it can be done simply for pleasure or as something that's purposeful. It's something that's social and also provides physical stress. So this idea of walking as being a particularly meaningful kind of exercise to people. Finally, Nicholls kind of wraps it up with a few points. This idea that emerges of illness, of breathlessness being something that patients work to manage, and that being ill is work for patients. And that when healthcare workers try to impose their treatment regimes and values, they can be at odds with the work that people are already doing. And then, of course, the idea that illness experience is complex and frequently perplexing, and that is also kind of in direct opposition to the structured healthcare with its tightly controlled rules and rituals and that kind of thing. So just the ways that people's experience of breathlessness butts up against the way healthcare is structured and the aims of healthcare today. And finally, this really interesting thing about trying to use people's metaphors and narratives as a way to connect with them and get to know the meaning of their illness. People use these metaphors all the time, he says, like a dark cloud, a battle, a wall, life closing in, that kind of thing. And he says that clinicians should actively listen for these narratives and metaphors, and that can be enlightening for them. So I think it's a really valuable read, a nice bit of qualitative research, and that will wrap it up there.